Hey, before we start the show, I need you to hit that subscribe button for me. ProducerHead only exists because of listeners like you who take that one simple action. It costs nothing and means everything as we continue to build this community and bring in more and more top tier producers to spread knowledge. The bigger this community grows, the more we all level up together. Thank you for supporting this project, me and ProducerHead. All right, let's get into it. Yo, what's up? This is Toru, music producer, entrepreneur, and host of this show, ProducerHead. Welcome to part one of my conversation with Mark de Clive-Lowe, pioneering jazz pianist, producer, and performer. Mark de Clive-Lowe has masterfully bridged the worlds of jazz and electronic music for over 2 decades. Known for his innovative approach to merging acoustic instrumentation with electronic production and live sampling, he's been an influential figure in the broken beat scene and has collaborated with numerous respected artists across the jazz and electronic spectrum. All right, with that, please enjoy part one of my conversation with Mark de Clive-Lowe. How can you hear somebody reaching for mastery in music that lacks maybe like a conventional sort of complexity?
What a great question. Incidentally, I was at a meal last night and someone asked a question and someone else was like, yeah, that's a great question. And we were laughing how that's something you'd say in a podcast or an interview to stall for time while you think of the answer. But
Here I am stalling.
Yeah. Right? But it is an awesome question. I think if it's something different, like if I'm hearing something I haven't heard before, or it might be really simple, but it's putting elements together in an unexpected way, and that can happen now with a lot of kind of producer music, sample chop music, where someone might not understand harmony academically, but they might chop and flip something in a way which results in something which is actually very harmonically complex, but deceptively simple. And there's a lot of music like that. And I mean, simplicity is also a funny thing. It's like there's a lot of boom bap hip hop which you could say is simple, but there's subtleties in the production, and then the way the cadence of rhyme flow is often a lot more complex than it appears. And so I think simplicity it's not always simple, even though it might seem simple. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So when I think about continue on this idea of producers and people chopping and flipping things who are making music in quote unquote non-conventional ways. And when I say that, I really just mean, they're not playing a traditional instrument,
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it comes in a way, I think a lot about that. I'm like, these guys just have incredible taste, right? Like they really know when something sounds good to them. And that's maybe very often independent of whatever rules exist, right?
100%.
And so my question is, how do you develop good taste?
How do you develop good taste? I mean, some people would say you're born with it, but I'm not sure if that's the case. I mean, I think many people are fortunate to be mentored with good taste, and that could mean, like my big brother gave me an Ahmad Jamal record when I was 10 years old called The Awakening. Still my favorite jazz trio record to this day. It's the backbone of so many ridiculous hip hop beats, which didn't exist when I was given it, to be honest. It was still just that trio record. But that was mentorship and taste. And I've been fortunate to be around a lot of musicians and producers and DJs who just have great taste. And that's helped me develop my taste. But also, I've always been quite reactive, like things I do and don't like, and didn't understand why I didn't like things at a young age. And I guess something about that is being true to one's own emotional reaction to something. Like, I'm not gonna, if you play me something that has 100 million streams and has been number one all over the world, that doesn't affect if I like it or not. And maybe for some people that might affect it, this is something I hate about Spotify, how you go to a profile and it has how many followers or how many listeners or all that, like the metrics. It's like music is not about metrics. It's like, how does it feel? And so I think being able to be, honest about your own emotional meter with music is important. And I loved I loved growing up and finding music that none of my friends had heard or knew what it was. And it became, I guess it's kind of identity politics, but it became like, this is my thing and this is what I relate to. And I get to share it with you because you've never heard it. And it wasn't because it's, viral or something. Uh, I'm kind of being tangential now, but to your question. But yeah, I guess being open minded is important, and surrounding yourself with people who have good taste. Yeah,
Yeah,
and also not being scared to have your own taste. I think that's important too.
so at some point not too long ago, I came across like a Chick Corea interview clip, and it was him saying that, like, the world doesn't need you to make music that other people like. What sounds good to you? You know what I mean? And to really be, and I think that is like that identity piece, and that like developing that sense of comms, like what sounds good to you. And I think, to your point about getting surprised, I mean, I think that's, there's no recipe for that, but I think that's the thing is like, if you can really get super connected to whatever makes you, you, and express that musically, that's going to surprise people because nobody else, can do it. And that is like maybe connected to some of the, we're going to come back because I have other questions about the mastery stuff, but I think about that stuff kind of is like embedded within that sort of quest, if you will.
Absolutely. I mean, like we were talking about Bjork before, and she, she never kneeled before the industry, and an artist like that may not get signed today. And there were many artists in the past like that who might not get signed today. I mean, Marvin Gaye might not get signed. David Bowie might not get signed. Like, there's just people who've changed the trajectory of culture who in today's industry might not get signed because there's so much kind of pandering, like bending the knee to industry and trend and just being scared to be different. And I mean, when I lived in LA, I was summoned to a very, very, very successful producer's studio. And the producer was like, "Yeah, man, I'm just looking for that, like a whole new sound." And I was like, "Cool, that's exciting," and started talking about different things and approaches and kind of musical language things and listening to some music and then he's kind of auditioning me for whether we would collaborate or whatever, I guess. And then he ends up with this crew of kids who just did the same old thing he'd always done, and the next record sounded just the same, but maybe a tiny bit different. And so I think that's someone who's just deep, 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 deep in the industry. Yeah, just not. I think people should have the balls to put up the middle finger to the industry and to expectation and the norm, and have fun with it. Be playful and experiment, and don't be scared to do something different.
Yeah. So, well, I love that. So that's interesting, right? Because you're like, in a sense, you're like, here's this, like, be bold enough to be yourself and throw your middle finger up at whoever, you need to in order to kind of continue on the path that you feel is correct for you or proper for you. And at the same time, I know you have this hot take about bring back gatekeepers. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because it's an interesting, it's not necessarily like a contradiction, but there's an interesting friction there,
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think we famously live in an era where it's open access. Anyone can make and release music and just publish it, distribute it. It's very different to how it used to be. And I think gatekeeper, like the word itself, has it kind of in this period in history has a kind of a stigmatized negative connotation that is not what I'm kind of speaking to so much. I love the idea that there are people who they could be other peers. They could be other musicians or producers, or they could be record label A&Rs when such a thing truly existed, who gatekeep, because it's basically quality control. And the gatekeeper could even be yourself. And that's something which, I experienced at a very young age when I was growing up in New Zealand. And I was aspiring to be like a straight ahead jazz piano player. I wanted to go to New York and play with all the legends kind of thing. And I remember someone said to me one day, they were like, why don't you try and get signed to Blue Note? Like that'll be, that's the jazz, that's the legendary jazz label. And I remember saying at the time, I was 17, and I probably did have an elevated opinion of myself at that age, but I remember saying, look, even if Blue Note did come to me right now and offered me a deal, I would say no, because I'm not ready. And so in that sense, that's gatekeeping myself, like knowing I'm not ready. And then that led on to, I had a record that I took, kind of pre-sending files. I took it by hand around the world to different labels, trying to get them to license it or sign it. And so many labels were like, nah, it's not right for us, and it's not right for us. And that was fine. Like, you got to, it helped me find the right paths and channels for me creatively and in business, and understanding my station. It's like, if everyone was as amazing as, the internet tells us, then I feel like culture would be in a different place.
What's your take on like the level of patience we do or don't have as musicians and artists today?
I mean, those who know for sure. And so, and I imagine anyone who hears this and kind of, balks at what I'm saying, like, well, you're probably not like this anyway. But I think there is a demographic who are in a rush. It's like, let me get the viral hit, and then as soon as I get the viral hit, I'm going on tour. I want a headline tour, and within a year, I want to be playing Madison Square Garden or whatever it might be. And there is a rush, and I think I truly believe it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's chess, not checkers, and all that stuff. And it's the point whatever percent who make it to that scale. And at the same time, there is a middle ground, like I guess a middle class of musicians and producers and music creators who are making really, really interesting stuff. And many of them, most people will never hear of. But they make a decent living. And they survive and thrive doing what they want to do without bending knee to trend in industry. And I feel like that's where culture gets pushed, and that's where the envelope gets pushed. And to me, that's something that's just so important, because if we're not, okay, now I'm about to get a little more macro. Like, we live in a very, very capitalist world, and some would say post-capitalist or hyper-capitalist world. And I think culture is the antidote, and it's a culture versus capitalism kind of war. And I feel like if you're not proactively contributing to culture, then you're proactively contributing to capitalism. And that is problematic. To me, that goes without saying. Like, yeah.
That piece that you mentioned around kind of, you seem to have it, you had a sense that you just knew you weren't ready, like if Blue Note had come to you at that particular time. And that it's kind of like this sense of like self-awareness, right? And like kind of like self-regulating in a way. And I guess, how do you know when to trust that? Like when are you potentially doing that in a way that maybe blocks you from doing something, like where you're maybe avoiding an opportunity or a challenge of some kind? Or, you know what I'm saying? Like that kind of flip of like being like maybe in a sense, like maybe overtly humble or avoiding maybe progress and staying at a comfortable place when maybe you are ready. How do you discern the difference, and know which side of that you're on in a particular time?
Yeah, man. I mean, there's a sense where you're never ready. Like it's the eternal student or eternal beginner kind of thing. But I think that knowledge of the past, which in my life has been being a student of the masters and understanding that we stand on the shoulders of giants who came before us, and really loving their work and studying it and absorbing it and digesting it. That's always helped me keep a perspective of where I'm at in relation to that. Like if I'm I know pretty much Herbie Hancock or Miles Davis's entire catalog. I know, especially when I was younger, I knew that I'm not at that ilk. Like, I'm not at that level. I'm not ready. And then as time goes on and I kind of found my own voice musically and understood how I could contribute in collaboration and built community, found community through that. And with community, I think community really reflects back to you in a really healthy way where you're at. And then community often, it kind of evolves into industry and opportunity. And then you see how people react. And I guess I'm kind of thinking in an older model because nowadays seeing how people react is, what happens to your TikTok post or whatever it might be. But in the more kind of analog sense, as far as in the room with you or in the club where you're performing and just like in IRL, like that kind of tells you where it's at. I guess overall for me, yeah, the more I understood that I'd found my own kind of my own voice creatively was where I knew I had something to share.
Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying this episode, I've got a small favor to ask. ProducerHead grows thanks to listeners and supporters like you. So if something here resonates, take a second to follow, like, or subscribe. Your support means everything. By subscribing and sharing, you help us grow the ProducerHead community, which allows us to continue bringing you incredible conversations like this and opens the door to even more exciting guests in the future. Let's keep building this together. All right, now back to the episode. Yeah, it's really cool. I mean, it's a combination of like we were talking about kind of getting in touch with like what is my taste, what's my voice, but also because you did hold records of others in such high regard and really study them, you were also able, when you do that, you can be a little bit more objective about kind of where what you make versus what other people are making and where it is that you'd like to be. Or like you said, I love the word contribution of like trying to put something back in, after everything that you've listened or taken, in a way.
Yeah, man. And but also finding the right table you want to sit at. Like I definitely, in my younger years, just wanting so bad to be a real kind of jazz musician. And then the more I got into hip hop and then jungle and drum and bass and stuff, and then I couldn't really sit at the jazz table in the same way. And there were certain people at the table who'd be like, "Yeah, you don't belong at this table." And so there's those weird kind of the social politics of genre and community were interesting too. But that wasn't disheartening because I knew that there was something I was very passionate about and pursuing and had a curiosity about, which led me to really develop my sound and then ironically, like the coming full circle, like I started a monthly residency club night in LA and New York in about 2012, I think. And that was like, especially in New York, like all the people I had grown up listening to and just loving so much, they would come and hang and they'd end up, collaborating with me, playing on the club night and stuff. And that was because I developed my own approach and concept and sound that was different to what everyone had. So there was a curiosity from them. And so that was a great lesson in, difference being an advantage rather than similarity.
I don't know. I tend to think that, I love the idea of like kind of which table you're sitting at. That what may attract us to a certain table is often like a lot different from like maybe like what's actually the most natural to us, like what motivates us, like, because we want some kind of external validation or recognition, right? But that's something that's generally outside of our control, right? What you can control is like, to your point, like what are you making and where does it fall along it, and then that kind of tells you where you belong. You don't have to like ask to sit somewhere, you just sit where your music takes you. And that's like a really kind of, it's just like working more inside out than it is to try to like, I want to go over there and try to fit in. And that's a really subtle, but I think pretty like powerful distinction to change the way that you approach your art or your music or your career of any kind, really, right?
Yeah, man. I mean, I think goes with friendships, relationships, anywhere. It's like if you're at the wrong table, at some point you got to realize that.
Yeah, be honest with yourself about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So last time we talked, man, you mentioned this kind of since 2017, this return to roots.
Mm.
And I want to hear all about this in more detail. And also, what inspired it in the first place? Was there a sense that there was like a little piece missing? Or did something kind of suddenly pop up that was shiny and attractive? What was the impetus?
Yeah. I mean, I grew up primarily in New Zealand, mixed Japanese New Zealander, and I never felt like I fitted in. Like I felt I didn't have the language for it then, but now we would say I felt othered. I was othered, and so I feel like life has been this kind of search for belonging and identity, which I guess it is for everybody, but I felt it very palpably. And the longer, like I spent time in Japan growing up. I go there every summer to see family. I finished high school there. I didn't imagine I would live here, but over, I would say at this point, the last 10 years almost, I became more and more drawn to Japan as I got older. And I used to say that I felt like Japan was my spiritual home and New Zealand was my body's home, having been born and raised there. But then the where's home question, I'd spent 10 years living in London, 15 in LA. Like if I had these different homes and had put down roots in these places, but still never quite felt like I belonged. And that was the question. I think the gateway turning point was an ayahuasca ceremony in LA, and that was pretty revelatory and profound, and led me to, for me, that kind of directly led to an opportunity in LA where I did my first production of a concert, composing music and performing music, which was very much themed around my Japanese roots, and bringing that into the narrative in a way I'd never done before. I'd always been too scared to do that before because it felt too personal and too vulnerable. And then when I remember the very first concert of that music, I just felt something I'd never felt before. Like I felt like, oh, this is me. Like I love playing all the different forms and styles that I lean into. But this was the first time I was able to play in a context where I was defining the paradigm. And that felt incredible. And that ended up leading me more and more down that rabbit hole. Like how can I incorporate this more, and this desire to really dive into ancestry and roots and find the meaning in that. And the more and more I've done that, the more and more I feel it gives me a narrative framework to create around. Whereas, maybe 20 years ago, I was like, wow, how dope can I make this beat? Like, how hip can I make this moment? And that aesthetic stuff is cool. But I think as I've grown older, I want to deepen my craft, and that's not just in the execution of actual, composition or production or performance. It has to be what does this mean to me? And so then a couple of years ago, I was in Japan on a research fellowship, actually retracing my dad's journey here. He died like 12 years ago, but he spent 20 years here through the 60s and 70s, 50s and 60s. And so I retraced his journey, and it was super magical and profound. And partway through that, I just realized, I was like, wow, this is where I want to be. And so I decided to leave LA, relocate here, move here. And it's an amazing feeling. It's like I feel like I'm really in the right place for my story. And just it brings so much more possibility and inspiration. It's a beautiful thing.
It feels so much in line with what we were just talking about before, which is this idea of like kind of like getting that deeper connection with your identity and yourself, to understand like who and what that is. But what's interesting, right, is like you were already in a place where like you from what it seems like you were somebody who had a strong sense of like their musical identity, their style, what table they were at. But then it's like now, as you kind of went through this kind of like retracing your dad's, like part of your dad's life, maybe better understanding or having more information about the context of his life and therefore your own life, that now you've like kind of broke the ceiling or the floor on that, however you want to think about it. And now you've gone even deeper beyond the musical piece. And there's now this like kind of deeper place that you have access to from which you can work.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
absolutely
what does that feel like?
It feels good. It's great because I mean, I kind of alluded to this just before, but when I really kind of committed to this possibility, like I put out a 2-album series called Heritage in 2019, and it was, the earlier concert I mentioned was like a one-off show, but this was like a record and a whole. It was a commitment. And I remember before the first LA the album launch show, I was so nervous about it. I hadn't shared something that personal before, and I would tell the stories behind every composition before we play them, and it was really very. It felt naked, in the sense of being vulnerable. And I realized afterwards, talking to people who were at the show, just how much they connected with it. And at first, I thought, if people are part Japanese or Japanese, they might connect with this. But no, like everyone connected with it, and it just kind of rang this bell for people about ancestry and roots and connect and those connections. And so that moment showed me that the vulnerability is where is a strength, and how much that can be the framework for my creativity. Whereas before, maybe it was, I don't know if you've ever seen the Spike Lee movie Mo Better Blues, but it's one of Spike Lee's classics, and it's a 90s New York jazz film, and it's a dope film. The music's incredible, and it looks it looks hip. And I swallowed that hook, line, and sinker. It was like, give me the hipness. I'll take the hipness. And then same with club music. Like there was a lot of things I loved about that, which were not just the music. It was the culture and the aesthetic of the culture. But this just felt different. It was really from the heart, which was something which, I think some people connect with that at a much younger age, and they always have that. Some people may never connect with it or never feel the need to connect with it in their music or their industry. But for me, it's become like a lifeline, for sure.
It just sounds like it's such a lasting and deep impact, that process. And I'm wondering, has anybody told you, or like, what do you think maybe people that your friends, family, the people that you work with, like, are there visible, noticeable things from their perspective, you think, after, like, kind of before and after you had kind of gone through this process?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I definitely, one of my closest friends in LA who came to the very first show I did of this material, I remember him saying straight after the show, like, this is a mark I've never seen before. This is a whole new thing. And yeah, I think there's a difference with, I mean, any artist through history who, and I'm not, I don't want to bring up anyone to be like comparing myself, so maybe a non-musical one's good. So like, say, a Picasso. You look at early Picasso, he was a master of the history. And then you look at when he found his voice, his style, there's nothing like it. It's just Picasso. It's a Picasso when you think of what does Picasso look like? What does a Picasso look like? And I think it's that difference. Like, it's like when I hear young musicians now, and they might sound like young or like students, and they haven't found their voice, they haven't found themselves in the music. It's pretty clear. And then when they do, it's a whole different thing. And then it's interesting because when that happens, the kind of the objective excellence of execution, like how good are they, matters less, because I'm hearing your voice. Which is kind of like when, like, Miles Davis would play his trumpet and he'd crack a lot of notes. And a purist trumpet player would be like, yeah, but Miles was always cracking notes. That's not correct. but that's part of him. That's his sound, his story, his style, his personality, and so you take it. It's like that's you wouldn't want to be without it. So yeah, that kind of when the when the student reaches a certain level of mastery and finds themselves in that, then there's a vulnerability to be able to show your shortcomings or your blemishes or your warts, and it's like, this is who I am. And that's the kind of no fucks given thing, which for me has been an ongoing process to get to that point. And now it's just like, well, this is what I do, and if you don't like it, cool. But some people do, and more importantly, I do.
So a really cool distinction is that, you mentioned like kind of on this process and like kind of maybe something we can characterize like kind of maybe a little bit of your evolution is when you were younger, you're like, how dope can I make this beat, right? And how hip can I make this moment, to how can I make something that is more, I don't know, I don't want to say it for you, but just maybe something more meaningful, something more me, something more honest. And so I'm wondering, like, now that you have the experience of kind of like having gone through both of those things, like, and we talked about this a little bit, but like, how do you think about, as somebody who's on the path and trying to do something, what do you say to somebody who's like, I'm not sure what to do, but I know that I need to, there's like an artistic component and there's a technical component, right? And they're not necessarily like in their own vacuums, but they also aren't completely intertwined, and they kind of need to be approached. And so how do you think about like kind of like the way to approach that, and how do you deal with like kind of that tension, that coexistence of those two things?
Yeah, man. I don't know if I have a definitive on it, but I do think that the technical component is obviously really important, and that at some point you've got to put in your 10,000 hours, whether that's on a DAW or on a guitar or whatever it is. The jazzers would call it going to the shed. You got to spend time in the shed. That's vital. And I think the artistry component is, I think it comes from many things. I think it comes from humility to the craft, and humility to those that laid the path before you. I think it comes from playfulness and curiosity, and not being caught up in the industry and the flavor of the day or the sound of the time, the moment, and having a diverse diet. Not eating the same music every day, having some vegetables now and then, maybe. But yeah, just exploring, being curious and exploring and being open-minded, and I think all those things kind of they kind of osmosify and lead one to oneself in a kind of a roundabout way. There are definitely some more kind of savant-y artists who just seem to mature in a vacuum, which it absolutely happens. I don't think that's most people. I think it's definitely more of a journey for most. So yeah, something along those lines.
What do you say to somebody who's listening to this and goes, 10,000 hours sounds like a lot. There's AI now. I'm going to find a shortcut. Like, right. What shortcuts do you see there?
Yeah, I mean, that is a really interesting idea in general. I have a son in college, and I see his generation. I kind of think of them as the 1,000-hour generation, like, because part of the 10,000 hours for me growing up was to find the information and to work out how to digest it, how to apply it, how to practice it. And now that's mostly, a lot of that's done for us, whether it's AI or YouTube or whatever it might be, the ghost knowledge online. But I still think if you want to, like, mastery still takes time. Like, it's a benefit to having a shortcut, as far as you don't have to, research how to anymore, but you still have to apply. And the application, I mean, mastery, I think, is something which exists when you don't have to think about a process. You have a freedom in the process, to express. It's like a shortcut between your imagination, your brain, and your output. It can happen very fluidly. Most of us have a relative mastery of our native speaking language. We have an idea, we can say it. It's the same thing that I think you want to reach for, whether it's painting or cooking or music or whatever it might be. I have a friend who can just think of something and then build it, like carpentry. He doesn't have to draw it or make a plan or anything. He just builds it. And I just don't understand that. That's mastery. He's spent many, many, many hours doing that, and every time he does it is more hours. So 10,000 hours maybe does sound like a lot, but I haven't done the math on it, but I'm sure if you break it down, it's actually not that much. Like it's a thing. If you do an hour a day, it's not going to be much. Yeah, which is, and I know I so understand being like, I remember when I was 20, and if someone's saying, yeah, well, when you're 30, and that just sounds like forever away, but that time does fly, and it's not difficult to put in 15, 30, 45 minutes a day on something you want to really be able to have as part of your expression.
All right, that's it for part 1 of my conversation with Mark Clive-Lowe. In part 2, we dive deeper into his creative process, his approach to time management, his experience relocating to Japan, and some special insights into his musical influences. Do not miss it. Thanks again for tuning in to ProducerHead. Subscribe and join our community over at producerhead.substack.com so you never miss an episode. Substack subscribers receive exclusive access to the bi-weekly podium, the curation of my favorite discoveries on and offline over the past week. You'll also get access to ProducerHead bars, where I share the best of what's been shared with me to help you and other producers in our community grow. The podium and ProducerHead bars are designed to provide immediate inspiration and direct application in your creative process. So, subscribe at producerhead.substack.com to receive real inspiration and ideas you can use to elevate your own process today. If you care for the craft, get your exclusive access at producerhead.substack.com. This episode was co-produced, engineered, and edited by Matthew Diaz. Big thank you to him. From ProducerHead, this is Toru, and in a way, so are you. Peace.